I have a few more classes on this introductory material, and we'll start going book by book and looking in at what Brother Whitaker has put out there for us concerning each book as we will study throughout the year. And so we are in now part 3 of 5 of the overview, looking at these Old Testament themes. And we're going to actually start backwards this morning. So there are one-word book summaries, and we'll start there, and then we'll get into the Old Testament themes here in just a minute. Let's just be reminded of where we've been so far. We've looked initially there at the covenant clues and the messianic map, noticing the genealogy of Christ and the seed line and the relevance of that as you think about Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. You even think about the initial prophecy that God provides in the garden as the serpent is dealt with and as Adam and Eve are dealt with concerning their sin. And the words of the Lord there in Genesis chapter 3 in verse 15 specifically. And again, that seed and that messianic prophecy is going to be reiterated and also further narrowed throughout time. So you think of what is initially stated here in Genesis chapter 3, Christ, the seed line of the Messiah, would come through the seed of woman. Well, that's extremely broad, obviously. And then it's through the seed line of Abraham, which is also very broad. However, the fact that a seed line can be maintained for the amount of time that it was maintained, hundreds and hundreds of years, is astounding. But then God narrows it even further, and you think about David and the messianic prophecy that then is stated to David, specifically there. If you look at 2 Samuel chapter 7, 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 12, when your days are fulfilled and you rest with your fathers, I will set up your seed after you, who will come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. And then you think about what Matthew states in Matthew chapter 1, as we've noted time and time again. Matthew emphasizes the fact that Jesus being born was of the seed line of David. Matthew chapter 1 and verse 1, Matthew chapter 1 and verse 17, Matthew chapter 1 as Joseph is being spoken to, verse 20. So again, God further narrows this promise that Jesus would be coming from where he came from. And so we looked at the messianic seed line, messianic map. We looked at the covenant clues, these words that really identify for us God's dealing with mankind and the way in which he has dealt with mankind. You think about it from a legal perspective. God is just. God is a lawgiver. God is a lawyer in the sense that he is the one that operates and traffics with us according to law and logic and an understanding that aligns with simple, clear, point-for-point steps that are systematic. And so you think about how the world views God. Hey, God's a grandfatherly figure. God's up in the clouds somewhere and clueless and not aware of what's going on. He doesn't really care about us. It's no big deal. No, God operates with mankind and always has from the perspective of law. And so we looked at there at the beginning lessons, covenant clues. That matters when we think about understanding God, understanding his attributes, understanding how he's dealt with us, and again, how he's then fulfilled his promises through the messianic map. We then looked at redemption through the Bible and looked at several points there, going through here the redemptive plan as it relates to Christ, and we looked at that last week, and we also looked at Christ, the theme of the Bible as it relates to the Old Testament. And so God's redemptive plan would come through Christ, and throughout the Bible, we see that being established, we see that being furthered. And so that helps us be aware as we look at these verses. Again, an unchurched, biblically ignorant, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way, but someone who's not a student of the Bible, just beginning to pick up the pages of the Old Testament, may be a little bit confused as to what's going on. And so it's helpful to understand context. What is it that we're really reading? What is it that we're studying here? How is it that we gain wisdom and understanding regarding the salvation that's in Jesus as we study these words? And so all of these summaries, if you will, and the different ways that he's broken it up is helpful. And the same is true with our study this morning as we look, starting here, these one-word book summaries. And so think about pew packers. As we go through pew packers, as we look at different ways to understand the books of the Bible and different memory verses that the pew packer students should study and focus on, it's good to know as you're reading books, again, to just understand, hey, what's the big idea here? What is this particular book? I understand the overall context now, God's redemptive plan. We're learning about Jesus. We're learning about God delivering on his promises. But as I'm looking at this particular book, what is it really that I'm gaining in terms of the overall theme and the overall summary of that book? And so these are just one-word themes. Again, they're helpful. And obviously, you just look at this first one, Genesis, organization. I think we can understand that. You start reading the first couple chapters of Genesis, you understand, okay, God established creation and all of existence in a particular way, and it's in an organized fashion. And then throughout the book, we continue to get that organizational understanding as it relates to various nations, as it relates to, again, Abraham and his seed line, as it relates to then Abraham's offsprings, and ultimately then getting to Joseph into Egypt, just understanding how it all came about. Origination, organization, origination being Exodus, organization being Exodus, God organizing his people as they are exiting from Egypt, and so on and so forth. So we're not going to go through each one of these one-word book summaries, but we are going to look at the Old Testament themes. The Old Testament themes here, this is Roman numeral 15. And let's start off looking at, and we're just going to go kind of book by book. Obviously, as you've learned, we're not going to get through all of these each class because there's just a whole lot of material here. And so we're going to just cut it off when we run out of time. And so let's start here. Again, reminded, for whatsoever things are written aforetime, written for our learning. And then also Galatians chapter 4, verse 4. But when the fullness of time was come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law. And so with those in mind, those two verses in mind, as we're going through the Old Testament, let's look at the themes of these books. And so Genesis, the nature of God is revealed. If someone could read for me there, Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1. Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1. And again, think about that one-word book summary, origination. This is the very beginning of time being laid out for us in the book of Genesis. So the nature of God is revealed, Genesis 1 and verse 1.
In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth.
Okay, so very simple, very quick verse, but yet life-altering in terms of one's worldview. In the beginning, God created. What does that mean? That means God existed before the beginning. So what does that mean? It means God created the reality of time. He created physical things. So he is then not physical. And we know in John chapter 4, verse 24, he is spirit. So he which is spiritual, he which is eternal, he which is God, created that which is temporal, that which is physical, that which is man. The nature of God is revealed in the book of Genesis. The origination of creation is revealed in the book of Genesis. All right, let's look at Exodus. Again, Old Testament themes. The one-word book summary here, organization. Organization. Again, thinking about the organization of God and the way in which he's dealt with man. Again, God is one that deals with us from a legal perspective. Okay? God is like a judge. He will judge us. And that matters. When you start thinking about how the world views their predicament and their view of God. God means what he says. He's given us law. He expects it to be followed. He is organized in the way in which he deals with man. We reference Genesis being a book of organization. There, the one-word book summary is origination, but if you think about also, the entirety of the Bible is organized. God is patterned. And some of our very own brethren have given this idea that pattern theology is a crock, and it's unbiblical. And then guess what they do? They remove the pattern that's found in the Bible, and they establish their own pattern. Primary culprit of this is Rubel Shelley. Okay? When I look at the Bible, I find organization. I find law. I find consistency, clarity, understanding. And that, by the way, aligns with justice. As you think about the way in which he's dealt with me. That also aligns with comfort. That brings about comfort. We yearn for this. And you might say, well, the world doesn't look like they yearn for this. Look what happened in Atlanta last night. I get it. But look at a toddler. Toddler doesn't look like they yearn for structure. They run around, they draw on the walls, they throw food, they create chaos, they bring mud in the house. They don't look like they yearn for structure. But in reality, do they? Do they not appreciate a routine when it comes to being tucked in at night? Do they not appreciate a routine as it relates to their daily activities? Yes. Yes. There's comfort in that. And so God deals with us from a legal perspective. And when we look at the book of Exodus, we see his organization. We see that law is required for religion. If someone could read for me Exodus chapter 32 and verse 1, and then drop down to verse 15 and read verses 15 through 24. Exodus 32, verse 1, and then 15 through 24.
Now when the people saw that Moses delayed coming down from the mountain, people gathered together to Aaron and said to him, "Come, make us gods that shall go before us. For as for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." Moses turned and went down from the mountain. The 2 tablets of the testimony were in his hand. Tablets were written on both sides. On the one side and on the other, they were written. Now the tablets were the work of God, and the writing was the writing of God, engraved on the tablets. And when Joshua heard the noise of the people shouted, he said to Moses, "There is a noise of war." But he said, "It is not the noise of the shout of victory, nor the noise of the cry of defeat, but the sound of singing I hear." So it was, as soon as he came near the camp, he saw the calf and the dancing. So Moses' anger became hot. He cast the tablets out of his hand and broke them at the foot of the mountain. Then he took the calf which they had made, burned it in the fire, and ground it into powder. And he scattered it on the water, and made the children of Israel drink it. And as Moses said to Aaron, "What did this people do to you, that you have brought so great a sin upon them?" So Aaron said, "Do not let the anger of my Lord become hot. You know the people, that they are set on evil. For they said to me, 'Make us gods that shall go before us.' As for this Moses, the man who brought us out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." And I said to them, "Whoever has any gold, let them break it off." So they gave it to me, cast it into the fire, and this calf came out.
It's just shocking, isn't it? Man needs law. I mean, we do. From a governmental perspective, what happens without law? Anarchy, chaos. There is no structure. And it's only a matter of time until people realize, you know what? Structure is not such a bad thing. We need structure. It's interesting. I've been doing some desktop research for work, and I was looking up some remote work communities. And these are communities that are bound and determined to disrupt the way the world works. And they don't like structure. They don't like organization. They don't like having to abide by certain rules. And so they've created these communities. And they're vast, by the way. There's several of them. And they migrate all over the world and gather together at times on occasion to spend time with each other and have company. And lo and behold, as you start drilling down and looking at these rebellious communities, guess what you find? They've created their own constitution. They literally have created their own form of government, if you will. And so, what it really boils down to when man says God should not have law, and how could someone who loves have law, and how can we be structured, and we're really oppressed by having law, what really people are saying is, I don't agree with what it is I have to do, and so I'm going to discredit it as much as possible, and then once it's discredited enough, I'm going to establish my own because I want to be the one that makes the rules. God has dealt with us from a legal perspective. And law is required for religion. And we see that here in the book of Exodus. All right, let's think about Leviticus. Holiness and worship. Someone can read for me Leviticus chapter 10, verses 1 through 2. Leviticus chapter 10, verses 1 through 2.
Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, each took his censer and put fire in it, put incense on it, and offered profane fire before the Lord. He had not commanded them. So fire went out from the Lord and devoured them. They died before the Lord.
Okay. There was a time at a Freed Hardman open forum where someone proposed that God doesn't care how we worship. Doesn't matter what we do in worship. Doesn't matter how we approach God in worship. And someone raised their hand and said, what about Nadab and Abihu? And the person shot right back, spouted off, and said, who cares about Nadab and Abihu? They're dead. Well, true. How did they die? They died because their worship was not holy. Their worship was not sanctified. It was not in accordance with God's law. As a matter of fact, they worshiped God by doing something in addition to what God had commanded. They offered something that God did not command them to offer. Sometimes people get this idea, well, I'm able to do something, and I'm talented in this area or that area, and so God should accept it. Well, wait a second. Who is it we're approaching? We're approaching God. So who is it that we should follow? God. And with that logic, by the way, you could say just about anything. Well, I'm really talented at performing surgery. So does that mean I should perform surgery in front of an assembly of people and that is a way? No. God is to be approached in a particular way. And you even think about that word, worship. To kiss the hand of, or to kiss the ring. In other words, you are bowing yourself. You are humbly and reverently and in fear approaching one in authority, esteeming and exalting above yourself. And so in that approach, you want to do things exactly the way that God has commanded. And we see the result in not doing that here in the book of Leviticus, and also the entirety of the book laid out for us exactly what God expects as he's approached. Let's think about the book of Numbers. Discipline is needed for sin. Let's go to Numbers 13. This is kind of a lengthy section here. If someone could start off reading for me Numbers 13, starting in verse 30. Numbers 13, starting there in verse 30. And let's read through verse 10. And then if someone else can pick up from there and read verses 11 through 23. So Numbers 13, 30 through 14 and verse 10. And then someone else 11 through 23.
Caleb quieted the people before Moses, said, let us go up at once and take possession, for we cried out, saying, the land through which we have gone spies is the land that devours its inhabitants. And all the people whom we saw in it are men of great stature. There we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, came from the giants. And we were like grasshoppers in our own sight. So we were in their sight. So all the congregation lifted up their voices and cried, and the people wept that night. And all the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron. And the whole congregation said to them, if only we had died in the land of Egypt, or if only we had died in this wilderness. Why has the Lord brought us to this land to fall by the sword, that our wives and children should become victims? Would it not be better for us to return to Egypt? So they said to one another, let us select a leader and return to Egypt. Then Moses and Aaron fell on their faces before all the assembly of the congregation of the children of Israel. But Joshua, the son of Nun, and Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had spied out the land, tore their clothes. And they spoke to all the congregation of the children of Israel, saying, the land we passed through to spy out is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, then he will bring us into that land and give it to us, a land which flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord, nor fear the people of the land, for they are our bread. Their protection has departed for them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them. And all the congregation said to stone them with stones. Now the glory of the Lord appeared in the tabernacle of meeting before all the children of Israel.
All right, thank you, brother. If someone else can read 11 through 23 now.
And the Lord said to Moses, how long will these people reject me? How long will they not believe me? With all the signs which I have performed among them. I will strike them with pestilence and disinherit them. I will make of you a nation greater and mightier than they. And Moses said to the Lord, then the Egyptians will hear it, for by your might you brought these people up from among them. And they will tell it to the inhabitants of this land. They have heard that you, Lord, are among these people, that you, Lord, are seen face to face, and your cloud stands above them. And you go before them in a pillar of cloud by day and in a pillar of fire by night. Now, if you kill these people as one man, then the nations will have heard then the nations which have heard of your fame will speak, saying, because the Lord was not able to bring the people to the land which he swore to give them, therefore he killed them in the wilderness. And now I pray, let the power of the Lord be great, just as you have spoken, saying, the Lord is long-suffering and abundant in mercy, forgiving iniquity and transgression. But he by no means clears the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation.
Through 23, please.
Okay.
Thank you, brother.
Pardon the iniquity of this people, I pray, according to the greatness of your mercy, just as you have forgiven this people from Egypt until now. Then the Lord said, I have pardoned according to your word, but truly as I live, all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord. Because all these men who have seen my glory and the signs which I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and have put me on to the test now these 10 times, and have not heeded my voice, they certainly shall not see the land of which I swore to their fathers, nor shall any of those who rejected me see it.
All right, thank you, brother. So, a great feat that they were able to be freed from Egypt. And they were to inherit the promised land. But here we're going to have the wilderness wanderings because all of them will die in the wilderness and they will not get to inherit that promised land. Their offspring will. Does God discipline and deal with sin? Does sin require discipline? Is sin something that God just doesn't really pay attention to? God actually cites here how many times they've tested him. God's eternal. He doesn't forget. He doesn't, we think, and we've said before, we have this idea that forgiveness occurs when we have sin plus time. And if enough time has gone by, then sin is forgiven. No. Sin is dealt with. God deals with sin. So even though in this instance something's occurring that God is dealing with, God remembers what's already happened. And the stubbornness of this people. And so they're disciplined because of it. So again, thinking about what Brother Whitaker lays out for us, Romans 15:4, whatsoever things are written aforetime, written for our learning. We're learning of how God deals with his people. What God expects in terms of faithfulness. And that sin is dealt with. And God disciplines accordingly. Let's look at Deuteronomy. Learn from history. Deuteronomy, learn from history. Deuteronomy is the repeating of the law. Same law, but repeated. Let's look at Deuteronomy chapter 6. And another lengthy passage here we can split up verses 1 through 17. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 1 through 17. And I'll get us started here. And when I stop, you can just keep reading through verse 17. Now, this is the commandment, and these are the statutes and judgments which the Lord your God has commanded to teach you, that you may observe them in the land which you are crossing over to possess, that you may fear the Lord your God, to keep all his statutes and his commandments, which I command you, you and your son and your grandson, all the days of your life, and that your days may be prolonged. Therefore, hear, O Israel, and be careful to observe it, that it may be well with you, and that you may multiply greatly as the Lord God of your fathers has promised you, a land flowing with milk and honey. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. And these words which I command you today shall be in your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. All right, if someone could read through verse 17 for me.
Vineyards and olive trees which you did not plant, and you have eaten and are full. Then beware, lest you forget the Lord who brought you out of the house of bondage. You shall fear the Lord your God and serve him, and shall take oaths against him. You shall not go after other gods, the gods of these people who are all around you. For the Lord your God is a jealous God among you, lest the anger of the Lord your God be aroused against you to destroy you. You shall not tempt the Lord your God as you tempted him in Massah. You shall diligently keep the commandments of the Lord your God, his testimonies and his statutes.
All right, so think about here what God is emphasizing and the challenge that we all face as people. The need to be reminded and the need to learn from what's already occurred. We're going to find, and we're going to review here in just a few minutes, Judges, that there would be generations that would rise up that would not know the Lord. They would not follow his commands. If you notice verse 20 in the same chapter of Deuteronomy, when your son asks you in time to come, saying, what is the meaning of the testimonies, the statutes, and the judgments which the Lord our God has commanded you? Now, why is that being asked? Well, verses 1 through 9. But the child doesn't understand. You're telling me all these statutes. You're telling me all these commandments. What's the meaning of it? Why is it important? Why is it significant? Why are you telling me all this? Verse 21, then you shall say to your son, we were slaves of Pharaoh in Egypt, and the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand And the Lord showed us signs and wonders before our eyes, great and severe against Egypt, Pharaoh and all his household. Then he brought us out of there, that he might bring us in to give us the land of which he swore to our fathers. What was God saying to Moses as to the frustration regarding the sin of the people and them not going into the land in the book of Numbers? God says they saw all these signs. They saw my power. I brought them out of Egypt, yet they still don't trust me. They're not obeying me. And here we find in Deuteronomy that the children are to be taught of the law. The children are going to question, why are we keeping this law? And then they are to respond and say, let me tell you about what God's done and his power and his signs. The need to learn from history. Here's the hard thing about history. We know it when we've lived it. But those around us do not. I've learned that it is a vain exercise to talk to Hannah about matters pertaining to work. Because as I begin to explain things to her, I realize that my perspective and what I'm experiencing and all the various contacts and all the various interactions and all the ongoings of work, she is not aware of. And so the majority of what it is that I'm explaining, if I'm actually going to be able to bring her to an understanding of where I sit and understand my frustrations, I'm going to have to spend sometimes hours explaining all the particulars and details surrounding the context. And that task is not worth it, for obvious reasons. But in my mind, it's real. And so I feel as though all I need to do is say, oh, so-and-so blank. Oh, this event just happened blank. And that, by default, I used to think, she would just understand what I was talking about. But why doesn't she? Because she doesn't understand all the context. But yet, as the individual telling the situation, you don't realize that a lot of times. You think that individual shares your perspective and understands what it is you've experienced, but they haven't. What's the point? The point is that we as adults get an understanding of God. We get an understanding of his law. We get an understanding of his power, of his capabilities, of who he is, of why it is essential to abide in him. And we gain that from experience. We gain that from maturity. We gain that from years of study and all the context that we have found ourselves in given his law. And then what do? Sometimes we think that our children, that future generations, just have that perspective. And so therefore, all we need to do is just say the law. But more is needed. Much more is needed. How much more? So much so, if you look at Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 1 through 9, that God's word is to be constantly recited and in the view of the family. You might say, well, there may be a lot of questions from that. God deals with that. Notice verses 20 through 21. And then the explanation that is given thereafter. Fillers are then needed to provide context surrounding the significance and the importance of the law. And brethren, I'm telling you this as a preacher who has children who both Hannah and I, and I'm not putting them down, this is just the nature of children and the nature of this reality and this formula. We are blown away sometimes. Wait, you just thought what from a biblical perspective? Your understanding of God was what? Wait, you think this is okay? Really? Wait, you're not aware of this verse or this book? Really? And brethren, we're trying. We're trying. Now, what about those whose children? No instruction in the home. No memory work. No Bible verses. No discussions at the table. No drilling with the scripture over and over and over again. Are we surprised that we're using or losing our youth? History requires more than just mere exposure. And God lays this out for us in the book of Deuteronomy. Now, unfortunately, as we mentioned, when it comes to the book of Judges, and we'll just skip right there, they forgot it. And it's interesting because when you look at Judges, let's go to Judges 2, and the bell's about to ring, so we're going to try to speed through this briefly. Skipping over Joshua. Judges 2. Notice here, beginning of verse 7. So the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great works of the Lord, which he had done for Israel. Now Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died when he was 110 years old, and they buried him within the border of the inheritance at Timnath Heres in the mountains of Ephraim on the north side of Mount Gash. When all that generation had been gathered to their fathers, another generation arose after them who did not know the Lord nor the work which he had done for Israel. I have a question. Whose fault is that? Whose fault is that? That's the fault of the people who just died. It's their fault. Deuteronomy chapter 6. So this generation that comes up that does not know the Lord, does not know his works, does not know his commandments, why? Well, because those who just experienced it, those who were baked into it regarding their life, they believed the misconception and the fallacy that, well, that will just migrate over to my children. And that's not the way it works. And so you have then in the book of Judges, in Pew Packers we call it, cycling from sin to salvation. Here it's those who forsake God will be God forsaken. And we find it here in this very context through verse 19 that they would go and they would leave God. And what would happen after they left God? They would then cry to God and plead for deliverance. And what would God then provide them? A judge or a deliverer, one who would come and deliver them out of their bondage. And then they would be delivered out of their bondage, and what would happen? They would forget God again. And then what would happen? They would go back in to oppression. And that cycle continues throughout this very book. And so think about it from our perspective and why this is helpful for us concerning our understanding of the Old Testament and the connection there to Jesus. If we forsake God, God forsakes us. If we leave him, he leaves us. Think about Isaiah chapter 59, verses 1 and 2. It's not God's fault, but our sin is what separates us from him. And we find that, again, throughout the book of Judges. Thank you all very much for the class.